Hello, everyone. I'm George from Ireland. So, one of my numberless faithful viewers has asked for a video about the Bill of Rights. So, I'm going to do that. By that, I mean the Bill of Rights for England and Wales. I don't mean the American Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution, which is the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. Now, the sun has passed the yardarm, so it's time that I had my aperitif. Anyway, what is a bill? Well, a bill can mean a document, in this case, a piece of paper. But no, it could be in the United States, it's a banknote bill in that sense. It could be in a poster. I remember in Ireland as a child, outside the barracks in Ballincollig, there was painted on the wall, "Post no bill," as in don't stick up a poster. So we're talking about the document here, that kind of bill. Usually a bill is a proposal for a law in a legislature, and if it's passed, it becomes an act. So curiously, this is not called the Act of Rights. For some reason, it's stuck with the name Bill of Rights. So it was formulated in the spring of 1689 and received the royal assent in December that same year. People often erroneously say 1688 because a revolution had taken place in England and Wales that year, which then spread to Scotland very quickly. In Ireland, it was more contentious. Many of us, probably most of us, are fighting against it to keep James II on the throne of Ireland. So James II was a Catholic. Could a Catholic rule Protestant realms, England and Wales, and indeed Scotland? Could he rule a Catholic realm? Yes, definitely. But in England and Wales, and indeed Scotland, it was less popular. Bearing in mind that England and Wales was a separate kingdom from Scotland, even though they shared the same monarch. I don't want to go too much into the background to it, but the long and the short of it is he was about to be overthrown, looked like he was about to be overthrown by his son-in-law and nephew, William III, being the same person, both the son-in-law and the nephew of James II. So James II fled to France. His friend, Louis XIV, who'd been bankrolling him, sheltered him. Anyway, so some Protestants call it the Glorious Revolution. I'm going for a value-neutral term, the 1688 Revolution. But in consequence of the overthrow of James II, the Bill of Rights was passed. A new Parliament of England and Wales was summoned. Now, so it only applies then, not to Scotland. It never applied to Ireland. Well, though some people dispute that. Anyway, the major portion of Ireland, of course, we left the UK in 1921. Northern Ireland is still within the UK. It's not applicable to Northern Ireland, although, again, some people say, well, it ought to be because somehow English law, bits of it can apply to the whole of the UK. And I remember reading the Progressive Unionist Party's website, this is 20 years ago, and them saying they want a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. And I was genuinely not aware that this didn't apply to Northern Ireland at the time. Let me see. It was actually meant to be restating things that were already law, but I think some, not entirely, some of it was novel, clarifying them. So this is to be crystal clear for the avoidance of doubt, as statutes quite often say, saying that monarchs who might claim they have the power to suspend laws, but that's a pretended power. They in fact have no such legal power. They can only suspend laws with the agreement of a parliament. Let me see. So they can't impose taxes without Parliament's say so. Remember, Charles I had famously done so. One of the factors that led to the English Civil War. Now, people have, since Anglo-Saxon times in England, people saying that taxation without the agreement of Parliament is illegal. All right, not everyone agreed, but this was making this absolutely beyond dispute. So saying that the people had the right to petition the monarch, well, that wouldn't have been terribly controversial, but they'd often been petitioning in force in the 16th century, many jacqueries in the 16th century. But then you're not allowed to prosecute people for proposing a petition or in handing in a petition. It would seem to be dreadful to prosecute people for doing so. A petition is a document where, say, we, the undersigned, have whatever grievance, and we ask you to address it and get people to sign. That's a petition. You were asked to sign them on the street sometimes. So it's terrible. Anyone should be prosecuted for that. I don't know on what offence that would be. So that he was not allowed to keep a standing army in peacetime without the consent of Parliament. So notice all the caveats. If it's wartime, he doesn't need the agreement of Parliament. He can keep an army which isn't a standing army. as in a part-time army, militia, ordinary men doing whatever job, and but one evening a week they do some military training, something like that, willing to fight if war comes. Often there might be fencibles, as in short for defensible. They'll only fight within the realm. They won't go overseas to do battle. And yeomanry, which are a cavalry version of that, and must own your own horse. To be a yeoman was a certain social status, which is to say own your own steed. Because most people didn't have their own horse, so that ensured that the yeomen were all bourgeois, because they had to provide their own mount, and the militia were somewhat middle class because often they had to pay for their own weapons. So a firearm was very pricey in those days. And partly to maintain social order sometimes. So it was a very unequal system at the time. What else? So Protestants are allowed to possess weapons, including firearms. So notice Protestants only, there's sectarian discrimination. That earlier point about you can't have a standing army without the approval of Parliament was partly why there was no police force, not nationally in the UK, till the 1820s, because they said it was incompatible with a free society. It'd be used to oppress people, take away their liberty, and it could just bulldoze Parliament, arrest people arbitrarily, be poking their nose into your business. People would be subject to arbitrary searches and whatever, ransackings, things like that. So it would be too expensive, and that would be monstrous. I know London had one first because London was a special case, the police metropolis. In Ireland, we had the Peace Preservation Force slightly before that. There were parish constables, not a police force, a professional, trained, uniformed police force. Anyway, I'm digressing. So anyway, the people could elect whoever they wanted as Member of Parliament. At this time, they didn't have age restrictions or anything about nationality. You could elect them. Could they get in? Well, then they had to take an oath to say that they believed that the king was the head of the Church of England. I don't think it specifically mentioned the Church of Scotland, even after the Union of 1707, and to specifically abjure the authority of the Pope, or the Bishop of Rome, as they called him, somewhat demeaningly, even though Bishop of Rome is one of the Pope's official titles. That there was a freedom of expression in Parliament, is privileged in Parliament. You can say whatever you want, and that's one of the reasons Parliament is exempt from libel actions. You can say anything there, and it doesn't count as whatever, slander or libel, and indeed the press is free to report it so long as they do it. They've got qualified privilege to report it, so long as they do it in a fair manner. Let me see. They can't be impeached for what they do in Parliament. So reaffirming Parliament's relative independence from the Crown, which is why when there's that state opening of Parliament every November after election, when a black rod, that official who mostly wears black, a man distinguished in blood and arms, blood I suppose meaning his ancestry, arms as in weapons, he's a retired military officer usually, with a black stick, it really is a black rod, going up towards the door of the House of Commons, which is ceremonially slammed in his face, and getting his big staff and banging 3 times, and then the door being opened to him, and the door is slammed in his face to signify that Parliament is outside of the control of the Crown. And then he's allowed in, and then he's says that Her Majesty requests you join her in the House of Peers, and everyone from the House of Commons processes 2 by 2, as in pairing off their opposite number, Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Chancellor with a Shadow Chancellor, and so on, and then the backbenchers right at the back. But anyway, I'm going a little bit off topic. So when people were asked to post bail, it couldn't be excessive. How much is excessive? I don't know. That's up for judges to decide. So when you're arrested, if you're charged with a crime, you could be remanded in custody to await trial in prison. And whilst you're on trial, be in prison. So go from the prison to the courtroom for your trial, and back each night, prison to court and back, and prison to court and back, until the trial is over. But you could post bail, as in put up some money, say, okay, we'll allow you out, and you could live at home, so you've got to turn up for your hearings and all the rest of it. But if you run away, if you don't show up for your trial, your bail is lost, which is a certain amount of money or a house. Now, in some jurisdictions, certainly some states in the United States, someone else can put it up, and depending on how rich you are, on how high the flight risk is, they can set it higher and higher. On the other hand, they might not grant bail at all if they think there's a high chance you're going to run away, or it's a very major offence like murder. No matter how much money you offer, no, they're not going to let you have bail, because you might well skedaddle, might say, doesn't matter what the money is, I don't want to go to prison for life. Fines mustn't be unduly large. And again, this is repeating some of the ideas you'll find in Magna Carta, as in it's impermissible to fine a man to his utter ruin. Cruel and unusual punishments are prohibited. And again, you'll find that in the United States as well. So some of it they lifted directly from here. So if someone is charged with treason, with high treason, the jurymen can only be freeholders, as in how much they hold their property. Remember, that only the propertied class or part of the political nation could be jurors or had the rights to vote. Those who owned real property, I don't mean like clothes or jewelry or horses, had to be land and or buildings. So anyway, you couldn't impose fines and forfeitures before someone was found guilty of a crime. Anyway, so Parliament had to meet very often in order to deal with the issues facing the nation and to resolve the complaints people had about things. You know, the Parliament, King couldn't dissolve Parliament and say you're not meeting for another 20 years. Remember, England went 12 years without a Parliament under Charles I. Under Elizabeth I and other monarchs, it was up to 10 years, and that was nothing out of the ordinary. It's only when the monarch felt there were sufficient issues to be discussed that would require their counsel. James I thought that Parliament's role was solely consultative, only to give advice if he requested that advice, not to offer advice unsolicited. Or as he said, Parliament not sitting, liberties not sitting. He felt that liberties were at his will and pleasure, and he could suspend them by fiat. So one of the immediate things they dealt with was James II running away, because William, of that name the Third, the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, landed at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November, and Protestants felt that it was very apropos because that was the anniversary of the scotching of the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, and so they felt it was a date of happy augury for them, and equally auspicious, as a song writer said. Is that such a word, songwriter? Lyricist? Said, "'Twas his natal day," in the song Landing at Torbay. 'Twas not his natal day, 'twas the day after it. But it was so close that the librettist couldn't bear to let that one go, and had to stretch the truth and claim it was his birthday. It was a Protestant wind had carried him there. They went in for all this superstitious drivel. It was a centenary of the defeating of the Spanish Armada, which again was just sheer good luck for the English. The weather was going their way. Had the weather not been so inclement, the Spanish would have triumphed. England would have returned to Catholicism. Maybe relations between Ireland and England would have been rather better. So James II, when most of his army was deserting, including Sir John Churchill, ancestor of Winston, going over to William of Orange, James II took the Great Seal of England, got into a boat on the Thames, and dropped it into the water, thinking they can't make any laws without the Great Seal. Well, they'll just make a new one. And then he was stopped by some fishermen, held onto him. I think the fishermen decided for themselves. I don't think they got the order from anyone else to actually let him go. So he's hightailed it to France, and Parliament said, we deemed he's abdicated. By running away, he's abdicated. We didn't say he was abdicating, but he did this by conduct rather than by signing any document. So then it set out reasons why the country was better to be shot of James, of that name II, saying that he was trying to get rid of Protestantism. Now, they didn't actually have proof of this, but that is true. He'd signed the secret Treaty of Dover with the Sun King, who was giving him a bung, saying that he would restore Catholicism as a state religion just as soon as the security of his crown permitted. Now, as we know, they're probably never going to permit, because he hadn't even made much effort towards it, and even then he was overthrown on the slightest suspicion of it, because a very high majority of people in England and Wales were Protestants. If you were Catholic, you really had to keep it to yourself, because there was so much anti-Catholicism about, and saying that he was James II was trying to deprive people of their liberties, so that he was going to suspend laws, and he was going to do things without the agreement of Parliament, that he prosecuted 7 Anglican bishops, because he set up this new commission for ecclesiastical causes, that he was taxing without the agreement of Parliament, and that's not a royal prerogative. You can only tax with the approbation of the House of Commons, the House of Lords. He raised and maintained a standing army, during a time of no conflict, and he did so without the agreement to Parliament. He supposedly disarmed Protestants. I'm not exactly sure what they're referring to, and said, but the Roman Catholics are armed, and that's not allowed. So in Ireland, Catholics have been put in charge of the Irish army. Now, he'd appointed some Catholics to high office in England and Wales. That's fine. Come on, that's equality. He was very good friends with William Penn, one of the founders of Pennsylvania, who was a Quaker, who was the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of Christianity. Very gentle people, the Quakers, not anti-Catholic, even though they're hardline Protestants themselves. Anyway, so that James II hadn't respect the right of people to serve in Parliament, even when they're duly elected, and things like that. So he had prosecuted people at various courts for what they just said and done in Parliament. He'd put people on juries who didn't own sufficient property to be jurors. I'm not sure in which particular cases they're talking about here. So he imposed unduly high bail. So often this relates back to the legislation they passed there. There's the statute saying crystallizing the law and saying, well, this is why we had to pass it, because of these supposed abuses which were committed during the 3-year reign of James II. Imposing unduly ruinous fines and inflicting unusual and especially cruel punishments. So anyway, imposing fines on people, or indeed sequestering their property before they were found guilty of any crime. So that was all unacceptable according to them. Anyway, and then they specifically said that no Catholic can be king or queen, or anyone married to a Catholic can't be king or queen. Remember, Charles I was an Anglican, but his queen Henrietta Maria was a Catholic, and so on. And they said, because we've learnt the hard way that having a Catholic in charge is not good for the common weal, and is going to be destructive of our liberties, and so on. So Protestants at the time equated Protestantism with liberty. They did in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland anyway, but I mean, liberty was very slight compared to today. Very few people had the right to vote. The right, freedom of expression was rather limited. Now, I know in Catholic countries often even worse, because, okay, there's some Catholic absolute monarchies, but there were some Protestant absolute monarchies in Germany as well. So I don't think even the most liberal Protestant countries weren't that much better. And so there's some reasonable criticisms to be made of Catholicism, but some of it is just straightforward bigotry. Anyway, so that was it, excluding James II and his progeny from the throne by name, as well as the fact they're Catholics, even they turned to Protestantism with not having them. So they're hoping that William and Mary would produce a healthy race of children, but they never did. They said, well, how about the brood of Anne? That's Mary III's younger sister, or Mary II, sorry, younger sister, who's married to George, Prince of Denmark. Hence the Prince of Denmark's march. Dun 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 dun, played when Princess Diana walked up the aisle in July 1981 at her wedding. It was written for him by Jeremiah Clark, who was the organist of St Paul's Cathedral around that time. But that Princess Anne, well, in order to be fecund, she had to be amply nourished, to the point that she became morbidly obese and couldn't even waddle into Parliament for the state opening, so to be borne aloft by a dozen beefy lads. But her husband nevertheless did his duty, and she was delivered over a dozen infants, well, all but one of whom died whilst in swaddling bands. One of her sons, he made it to about the age of about 12, and then he died. He was mentally subnormal. Anyway, it went to the descendants of Sophia, Electress of Hanover. But that is just a very brief overview of the Bill of Rights. Read through the entire text for yourself. You'll find that it's couched in decidedly antiquated language. That's it from me on that one. Toodaloo.